enjoyed the conference so far. We have a lineup of 3 speakers for you today who will talk each 10 minutes about the effects of low doses of LSD and psilocybin and their effects on subjective state and cognition. My name is Kim Kuipers and I will be the moderator today, asking the questions you post in the chat, not in the Q&A. But I will ask them later on during the Q&A panel. So we will not have questions after the talks, but after the 3 talks. We end the session at 17:35. And if you then still have questions for the speakers, you can go to another virtual. So I would like to announce our first speaker of today. That is Nadia Hutte. Nadia Hutte is a PhD student at the Department of Psychopharmacology and Neuroscience, the Faculty of Psychology and Neuroscience at Maastricht University. She aims to understand the effects of microdosing with psychedelics on mood, cognition, and mental well-being. Survey studies, naturalistic studies, and placebo-controlled studies. And her talk will be on the placebo-controlled study she conducted. The floor is yours, Nadia.
We'll be sharing Nadia this time with sound. One moment, please.
Hello, my name is Nadia Hutte and I'm a PhD student at Maastricht University. And today I'm going to talk to you about our findings in our LSD microdosing placebo-controlled study. As you all have a background in psychedelics and also know what microdosing means, I'm just going to be brief about the definition. So microdosing is the intention to improve well-being, cognitive processes, and emotion. It's supposed to be subperceptual, so you don't have the visual alterations, and it's suggested that you could take 1/10 of your normal recreational dose in order not to have these visual alterations, and it often involves multiple dosing sessions. So what did we do? We included 24 healthy participants that came to our facilities on 4 different times for 4 different test days. And each test day they received a different dose. So placebo, 5, 10, and 20 micrograms. And the order of which dose they received is randomized across participants. So everybody had a different order of the test days. And then we examined, okay, which dose actually shows this improvement in cognition and emotion. But we were also interested in to see variation in response to these different doses in cognitive and subjective effects. So this is just a few of the measurements we had included in our study. Considering the time limit for this presentation, I cannot go over all the other measurements while we have so much information we gathered. So just try to include, to capture a broad essay of our study. So we had subjective effects, which we had the visual analog scales and profile of mood states. And with the visual analog scale, we measured, do you feel under the influence? Do you feel high? Do you feel concentrated? And with the profile of mood states, that questionnaire captures a broad range of different mood states like confusion, anxiety, depression, positive mood, all those kinds of mood states. I'm going to go over all these subscales in this presentation, but I'll give you a broad overview of what the effects were. And then we have cognitive measure. One of the tasks we included in this study is an attention task, like the psychomotor vigilance task. It's a very simple task where a participant reacts to a visual stimulus on the screen, and then we measure reaction time and the number of attentional lapses, which is when a reaction time exceeds 500 milliseconds, we consider that as an attention lapse. And then we have blood samples, so very interesting, where we examined, determined the BDNF levels, which is an indicator of neuroplasticity. So to go to the overview of how a test day looks like, this is broadly how it looks like, at least for the measurements I'm going to discuss in this presentation. So we have at T0, that is the administration of LSD or placebo. And before administration, we had a baseline measurements of subjective effects, but also baseline measures of BDNF and blood sample. And then throughout time, this is actually the time in hours after administration, you can see that we assess these subjective effects in regular intervals throughout the test day. And the PPT, the cognitive measure, we measure 2 and 4 hours after administration, and BDNF levels are in intervals of 2 hours after administration. And these are the results of the FAS questions. As you can see here, the question, do you feel under the influence? Do you feel high? And do you like the effect that you feel? And you can see that both the 20 and the 10 micrograms were higher compared to placebo. So participants could actually feel that they had an active substance that day, and they were under the influence by it. What is interesting is here, do you feel concentrated? And there we found that the 20 micrograms, actually participants felt less concentrated compared to placebo. So this is a normal, -5 is less concentrated and +5 is an increase in concentration. So this is quite interesting, because the anecdotal reports say that microdosing enhances your focus and feeling concentrated. While we see in this study with the 20 micrograms at least, people felt less concentrated. Then the mood states. And we did not find a dose effect on these different mood states on this questionnaire, but we did find individual variation. So as you can see here are all the different mood states, not all of them because I could not include it. And also the elation and fatigue and vigor were no effects found. And here you see the three different doses. So, and this is the proportion of the observations that in that dose showed an increased emotional state compared to placebo. So for instance, here in anxiety, you see that in the 5 micrograms, 77% of the observations showed an increased level in anxiety compared to placebo. It's interesting that the 5 micrograms already can increase a little bit in anxiety. And the p-value actually stands for whether the proportion of observation that showed an increase in anxiety significantly differed from the proportion of observation that showed a decrease in anxiety following that LSD dose. So you can see also here, to say with anxiety, the majority of the observations showed increased compared to 23%, and that showed decrease in anxiety following 5 micrograms. So it's interesting that you also see that happening in the 20 micrograms. The 10 micrograms shows a different profile than the 5 and 20 micrograms. It does not show an effect on anxiety, but we see that the majority had higher levels of confusion, and the minority showed a higher levels of anger, meaning that the majority showed a reduced level of anger. So here with depression, interesting that the minority showed an increase in depression, so the majority showed a decrease in depression following 20 micrograms. Also with positive mood, the majority showed an increase in positive mood following 20 micrograms. Then a cognitive effect, the PVT, psychomotor vigilance task. We see the attentional lapses here on time point 2 and 4 after administration. There was no main dose effect. Also on mean reaction time, there's also no main dose effect. You can also see the reaction time were quite stable across conditions. But we saw individual differences. We saw that the minority showed increased attentional lapses during the 5 and the 20 micrograms, meaning that the majority showed a decrease in attentional lapses in 5 and 20 micrograms, which is actually a positive effect. So people had less attentional lapses, so they improved in attention. Then the blood sample, BDNF levels. Here we did not have all blood sample from all 25 participants. We had some problems with blood drawing. So here you can see the number that were actually included in these analyses, these blood analyses. So here, this is the 5 micrograms. You can see the placebo is stable over time. And the 5 micrograms actually show an increase at 4 hours after administration and then slightly decreasing again. With the 10 micrograms, you see also placebo quite stable, a small increase, but not significantly different than the placebo. And the 20 microgram shows, again, stable placebo, but it shows an increase, and the highest level was at 6 hours. So it was really interesting to see what will happen after these 6 hours. Unfortunately, we didn't have a blood sample after that. So we don't know what happens after this. Maybe it's increasing or it's going to decrease. We don't know. It would be really interesting to see in the future. But at least this data shows that at biological level, we see effects of these lower levels of LSD. Just to conclude, we show that there's no placebo effect with microdosing, at least for LSD. We show that the 10 and 20 micrograms were noticeable among participants. They could really feel they had something. We have individual variation to the different doses, and it would be really interesting to see in future research what happens there. Why does someone respond to this microdose and why someone doesn't, to really see the biological mechanisms behind this. And for future steps, we can also see what happens in patient populations that really experience depression and attention deficits. All right, the acknowledgements, and then thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Nadia. So now we do not have questions. We will continue with our next speaker, who is Michiel van Elk. And Dr. van Elk holds a PhD in cognitive neuroscience. He has a background in philosophy, biological psychology, and psychology, and currently is the head of the Religion, Cognition, and Behavioral Lab at the Department of Psychology of Leiden University. His research focuses on psychedelic, religious, spiritual, and mystical experiences. And his talk today will be on the effects of psilocybin microdosing on awe and aesthetic experiences. Michiel, stage is yours.
Thank you, Kim, for the nice introduction. So my name is Michiel van Elk, and I'm now working at Leiden University. And today I would like to present my study on the effects of psilocybin microdosing on awe and aesthetic experiences. I would like to thank my collaborators who have contributed to this project, and also the Psychedelic Society in Netherlands who actually sponsored this study. So my interest is really in understanding the underlying causal mechanisms that help us to explain how psychedelics exert their effects. And you have all these different levels that have been described in the literature. And I'm specifically interested in this notion that psychedelics induce a sense of awe and wonder, and that this could actually underlie the therapeutic benefits of psychedelics. So this has been proposed, for instance, in a paper by Peter Hendricks that is describing awe as a putative mechanism underlying the effects of classic psychedelic-assisted therapy. And why am I interested in this? This is because there's this vast literature from a completely different domain, mostly social psychological literature, on feelings of awe and wonder that we can actually use to implement in psychedelic research. So there's work by Shiota that has proposed that feelings of awe are characterized by perceived vastness and a need for accommodation. So typically awe is this emotion that is elicited by vast objects, beautiful natural scenes, vast oceans, mountains, everything that is beyond yourself and bigger than yourself. And that this triggers a need for accommodation. So in light of those experiences, you need to accommodate your mental schemes, revise your mental beliefs about the world. So in previous studies, we have actually shown that absorption, this personality trait that has been developed to measure hypnosis proneness, that it also captures proneness for having feelings of awe. So people scoring high on the Telican absorption scale also score high on feelings of awe in many experiments. And not only that, in this paper, we actually review a lot of evidence showing that absorption captures a proclivity for spiritual experiences more broadly, be they triggered through meditation, through psychedelics, through awe-inducing stimuli, etc. But also, there's interesting literature suggesting that awe induces the notion of a small self, so that people literally feel small and insignificant when they're confronted with natural beauty and vast natural scenes. And when we were presenting participants in the fMRI scanner with awe-inducing scenes, awe-inducing videos, we actually observed that the default mode network was less active compared to other control conditions. And this decrease of activity was actually quite comparable to the effects that have been reported for psychedelics, for instance, suggesting that both awe and psychedelics could rely on a common neural mechanism. Now you might wonder, what does this have to do with microdosing? Well, our hypothesis basically was that microdosing would also enhance people's propensity for feelings of awe, because many microdoses actually report enhanced perceptions of reality when under the influence of a microdose. So just shortly, there's this increased societal trend to engage in psilocybin and LSD microdosing, in which subperceptual amounts of psychedelics are consumed on a regular basis. And users report a wide variety of reasons and motivations for engaging in microdosing, as we'll see later on. So we had the opportunity to do a double-blind controlled study, placebo-controlled, in which participants were taking either a microdose or a placebo, and they came to the University of Amsterdam lab at different time points, either when they were microdosing or when they were not microdosing. So we used a within subjects crossover design. So people started out either by microdosing or with a placebo. Then during a break, they didn't take anything, and then the condition assignments were reversed in the second half of the study. So you can find all hypotheses and materials that we use on the Open Science Framework, so you can check out this link. So next to the tasks reported here today, we also included a couple of other measures related to cognitive performance and perception. So it is a combined field lab-based study. So people were self-microdosing, so they gave the microdose to themselves, they took their dose at home, and then they came over to the University of Amsterdam lab in which they participated in our study. We had a sample of 30. We started out with 75 participants, but over the course of the trial, many people dropped out due to a lack of motivation. They used, in the active condition, 0.7 grams of trifles, which corresponds to about 1.5 milligram of psilocybin. So as experimental stimuli, we use stimuli that we have used before in studies of awe. So people were presented with awe-inducing videos of natural scenes, of positive videos representing funny animals, or of neutral videos representing cars moving along a highway. So this was for the awe-inducing stimuli. But we also were interested in aesthetic perception, because many people who microdose actually feel that artworks are more vivid, become more alive, and have more meaning assigned to them. So we presented people with artworks from different painters, abstract artworks, and we selected different paintings for each of the different painters. And one big advantage, I think, of this approach is that it has a high ecological validity, because you present people with stimuli that are actually more meaningful than abstract crosses and arrows pointing on the screen, as for instance used in many cognitive studies on microdosing. So by this we hope to capture like the natural effects of microdosing in an ecologically valid way. If you actually look at why people microdose, so this is what we asked prior to the start of the study, why do you microdose? And we gave them the option to select different expectations that they could have. You see that many people hope to experience more flow, to become more mindful, to have more energy, to feel more connection to the universe, to be more conscious. But also overall, you can see that there's quite a wide variety of different expectations, and that overall people score quite high on their expectations to microdose. Now for the all videos. So we had all videos, positive videos, and neutral videos. We found a main effect of psilocybin in microdosing compared to the placebo condition. So overall, people felt stronger feelings of awe in response to the videos when they were microdosing compared to when they were taking a placebo. And you can also see that this was most pronounced in the first session compared to the second session, and also most pronounced for the somewhat boring videos compared to the all videos. So especially the funny and the neutral videos were perceived to be more awe-inducing. For the art perception part of the study, we did not find very robust effects. We only found a marginal effect for one painter, which did not survive correction for multiple comparisons. So there was a main effect of microdosing on feelings of awe, but not on art perception. However, a problem that we encountered is that people broke blind already during or after the first block. So here you see the distribution of people guessing their experimental condition. And you can see that people are clearly above chance level when they're guessing whether they were taking psilocybin first or whether they were getting a placebo first. And this was even stronger following the second block. So most people were quite well able to tell if they were in the active or in the placebo condition. And when we factored this into our statistical analysis, it actually turned out that all the effects of microdosing on feelings of awe disappeared. And also when we factored in the effect of prior expectations on microdosing, the effects also disappeared. So it turns out that actually breaking blind and people responding prior to their prior expectations are actually contributing to the effects that we observed from microdosing on feelings of awe. So at face value, it seems as if microdosing increases feelings of awe. However, participants were breaking blind and the effects were completely driven by participants' prior expectations, as it seems. So actually this, to me, is quite an interesting finding because it shows the power of placebo effects. People were breaking blind based on very subtle physiological cues such as increased sweating, increased heart rate, etc. And based on that, they might have guessed their experimental condition, and this might have enhanced their perception of the awe stimuli, for instance. And we know that placebo effects can be quite powerful and can induce quite powerful experiences for participants. And actually this effect can also contribute to microdosing, I think. So we have used the placebo God helmet in earlier studies to induce mystical experiences. So we gave people the helmet and we told them that it would stimulate their brain. And actually many people in these circumstances had mystical experiences. But there's also this recent work by the Amiras lab on tripping on nothing, showing that if you give people a placebo psychedelic and in the right context and in the right setting, actually many people have a full-blown psychedelic experience, again showing that there's strong top-down effects on the experiences that people have. And this was very well illustrated by an excellent talk yesterday night by Ido Hartogson as part of the ICPR conference. And it makes me even more interested to study like what is the effect of the psychedelic substance itself, of the microdose, and what are the effects of the prior expectations on people's experience when they're microdosing. And currently we're trying to tease those apart in well-controlled studies. I would like to thank you for your attention and hope you enjoyed the rest of the conference.
Thank you so much, Michiel, about for your interesting talk on microdosing and the potential that it has partly placebo effects. Let's continue with our last speaker, and that is Dr. Tiketi, who holds a PhD in computational neuroscience from the University of Edinburgh. After graduating, he spent a few years as a biomedical software engineer at the Icahn Institute of Genetics in New York, before getting involved in psychedelic science. Today, he will tell us about his most recent work he conducted. It was a self-blinding study with microdoses, which he designed and completed now, and he is publishing on it now, I think. So the stage is yours.
Hello everybody, my name is Balaj and I'm here to talk to you about the self-blinding microdose study. Today is a very exciting day for us because we have been working on this project for 3 years now, and this is the first time that we are sharing our results. However, before showing you the data, I would like to tell you a little bit more about the structure of the study and what exactly is self-blinding. So this was an online study. Microdosers could have participated from all over the world just by completing some questionnaires. And such online studies have been done on microdosing before. However, where our study have innovated is that before starting to microdose, participants needed to complete a self-blinding setup procedure, which is essentially a set of step-by-step instructions how microdosers can incorporate placebo control into their microdosing routine without clinical supervision. I'm not going to have time to go all over all of the steps that self-blinding involves, but I would like to give you a flavor for it. So first, microdosers needed to hide their microdoses inside non-transparent gel capsules. And it was crucial that the capsules are non-transparent because empty capsules were used as placebos throughout the study. So once these two sets of capsules were constructed, microdosers needed to put these capsules into envelopes in certain order together with QR codes, and then those envelopes were shuffled, random numbers were generated, so on and so on. And the net result of this setup process was that everybody ended up with capsules enough for dosing for 4 weeks without knowing which of those capsules is a microdose and which of those capsules are placebos. And also crucial is that as some of these QR codes were scanned, they linked to the online system of our study, which allowed us to deduce who was microdosing and taking placebo as well. So this is the core of the self-blinding study. And at this point, you might be saying, is that, okay, this is cool, but why is it something that you should be excited about? And the best answer to that question is on the next slide. And I'm showing to you the number of participants throughout the study. And I've already highlighted the important number for you. The study was completed by 191 participants, making it easily the largest placebo-controlled study on psychedelics to date. Importantly, the cost of running this study were about 1% of running an equivalent clinical study. So we think that self-blinding is incredibly cool because it allowed us to do a very large sample size study with placebo control at a very cheap price. So that's about the methodology. What is it that we have found using this method? First, I'm going to show you the long-term outcomes, that is the changes before and after the 4 weeks long microdosing regime. So in this figure at the bottom, you can see the time points. First, we have the pre-regime, and then participants are microdosing for 4 weeks up until the post-regime. The study also had a long-term follow-up time point, but I'm going to ignore that in this presentation. So what you see here are the mindfulness scores of the microdose group. And as you can see, it increases from baseline, and even when you are considering the error bar. And indeed, if you do the math, this change comes out to be significant. However, it's going to get a lot more interesting when I add in the placebo control group into the figure. So the placebo group shown here in blue, these people were just doing placebos for the entire 4 weeks long duration. And as you can see that for the placebo group as well, there's an increase from the baseline to the post-regime. And indeed, if you do the math, this change is significant as well. However, what is crucial is that when you're doing this between group comparison, that is the difference between the placebo and the microdose group, then that's not significant anymore, suggesting that people in the microdose group did not improve more on the mindfulness scale relative to people in the placebo group. Now, this pattern was not just true for the mindfulness scale that we measured, but all of the long-term outcomes that we had in this study. In all of these outcomes, if you just look at the microdose group alone, then the score increases significantly from baseline to post-regime. However, in all cases, the placebo group improves similarly, and then the between group differences, that is the difference between the placebo and the microdose group, are not significant anymore. Now, what this suggests is that it actually makes no difference whether you are microdosing for 4 weeks or just taking empty placebo capsules for 4 weeks. These long-term outcomes were not the only thing that we have measured in the study. We also had acute outcomes. That is how you do in 2 to 6 hours after taking the capsule. Now, crucial to the study is that after participants completed these time points, we also asked them to take a guess. What capsule was it that they have taken earlier that day? Was it a placebo or a microdose? And this turns out to be very crucial because it allowed us to look at the data as the product of 2 binary variables. One of those variables is the condition, that is the actual capsule that the participant have taken. And it can have values of placebo or microdose. The other variable is the guess, which is what the participant thinks that he or she has taken. And again, it can have the 2 same values, placebo or microdose. And this first category is the case when participants have taken a placebo and thinks it was a placebo, and the score is about 13. What about the next category when people have taken a microdose but think it was a placebo? In this case, the scores are, but really by marginally, and this improvement is especially small when you add in the third category, That is, when people have taken a placebo, I think it was a microdose. In this case, the score goes up all the way to 18, and it stays about the same at the fourth category when people have taken a microdose and think it was a microdose. Now, just by looking at this figure, you can see that the difference is not seen to be driven by the condition, rather by the guess. And we can formalize this a little bit more by making pairwise comparisons between these four categories that I show you here. So that is what you are seeing on this slide. And first, I would just like you to focus on the left side of the figure. So what I'm going to do here is that I'm going to fix the guess and then making a comparison between the two drug conditions. So in this first comparison shown here, what I'm doing is that I'm only considering scores with the placebo guess, as you can see at the bottom with the green bar. And then I am comparing the two drug conditions, placebo versus microdose. And as you can see here, the p-value is non-significant. And the same is going to be the case is going to be the same when I am fixing the guess constant at the microdose and again comparing the two drug conditions, placebo versus microdose, the p is equal to 0.45. So what this suggests is that once you have accounted for the guess in the data, then the drug condition actually does not make any difference. Now, it's going to be the exact reverse story when we are going to keep the condition a constant and compare the guess, and that is what you can see here. So in this third comparison, as you can see by the green bar, I'm going to keep the condition constant at placebo. So I'm only considering scores when participants have taken placebo capsule and then comparing the two guess cases, placebo versus microdose. As you can see, the difference is highly significant. And again, we can see the same pattern when we are fixing the condition at microdose and comparing again the two guess cases, placebo versus microdose. So overall, what this suggested is that when it comes to these acute outcomes, what you have taken never makes a difference, but what you think you have taken always makes a difference. What I show you here on this plot is the PANA scores, which is a measure of acute emotional state. But crucially, the pattern that I just explained to you was not just true for this one particular measure, but it was true for all of the outcomes that we had in this study, both the acute and the post-acute ones, and we had 8 or 9 outcomes, which is a very, very consistent pattern in everything that we have measured, with one exception. And that one exception is what I show you here at the bottom right, that is acute cognitive performance. What's important to emphasize here is that the cognitive performance measured in the study was not a self-reported scale, whether it was an online implementation of clinically validated cognitive test. And in this case, neither condition nor the guess makes any difference to the outcomes. And if you think about it, it makes sense, because in this case, we are looking at much more objective outcomes, such as the reaction time or the number of items can be retrieved from memory. And these are going to be much less susceptible to the placebo effect compared to self-reported mood or self-reported emotional state. So unfortunately, I'm running out of time, so I cannot go into the details further. But the good news is that this manuscript is submitted and I'm going through peer review, so hopefully you can read about it sooner rather than later. So in summary, we have conducted the largest placebo-controlled study on psychedelics to date using the cell-blinding methodology that allowed us to conduct a very large sample study with placebo control at a fraction of, course, what an equivalent clinical study would be. Now, the limitation of the methodology is that participants have used their own drugs. And because of that, there are uncertainties with the drug and the precise dose that they have. And because of that, I would like to emphasize, don't think of these outcomes as clinical evidence. However, our study is representative of real-life microdosing. That is how microdosing is done in practice, with all of its uncertainty and variability due to the illegal status of psychedelics. In terms of the scientific conclusion, our studies, our data suggests that both the acute and the placebo effect. Last but not the least, I would like to acknowledge my collaborators, and most importantly, I would like to express my gratitude to everybody who has done the study. I hope some of you are audience. Thank you very much for helping us with this study. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Balázs. So we can start with the Q&A. A first question actually comes from me before we go to the questions of the audience, and that is, so you used people use their own LSD, but it also has been proven that on some blotter there is no LSD, so they might have been taking placebo. Have you ever tested the blotters?
No, we didn't have a way to do that. We explored that option, but it would have been just too complicated to do so.
Yeah.
But one thing which I would like to emphasize is that, so one thing is that, which Michael also talked about, is that very clearly also our participants were breaking blind. So, I mean, I'm sure, you know, sometimes, you know, it happened, what you just said, that somebody was taking a fake blotter. I'm sure there is at least one person in our study who was subject to that. But by and large, it does not seem to be true. And the other point which I would like to mention here, just a little bit, not completely explaining away this weak point of the study, but just giving some context, which I think is important, is that if you look at in our data, the break blind rate versus the dose, there is a statistically significant positive linear relationship between the two, which gives me some confidence that the self-reported doses are somewhat reliable. Of course, there are going to be exceptions, but statistically speaking, you get what you would expect, which is that the higher the dose, the more likely you are going to break blind. And just one more very small thing very quickly is that we calculated what is the threshold dose when participants have started to guess better than what you would expect at random. And what we get is 12 micrograms, which is basically exactly what the control study out from the University of Chicago got last year. According to their study, it was 13 micrograms. In our data, it's 12 micrograms. So again, that gives me some confidence that these self-reported doses are useful, even though I'm not denying that, yes, this is a limitation.
Yes, okay, thank you. Somebody asked, did people possibly break blind because they experienced more effects? And also related to that, did people ever leave the group because they guessed they were in the control group? That's both for Balázs and Michiel.
Sorry, the first question was? I couldn't find it online.
Did people possibly break blind because they experienced more effects?
Yes, that's definitely possible, but we don't have hard evidence for that. But it seems that most people use subtle physiological cues and prior experience, because most of the group in our study had done psychedelics before, so they knew the type of effects to expect and used that to infer their condition.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that was our experience as well. But in terms of leaving the group, what was interesting for us is that the dropout rate is exactly the same for all three groups. What I didn't show on the slides that we also had a half-half group, so people who were microdosing and who are doing placebos half of the time. But of course, all three groups, the dropout rate was exactly the same. So it seemed to be that people, even within the placebo group, stick with the study and went through with it.
And also the dropping out in the study that we did is unlikely due to motivational issues, because people knew that after their first block, they would be assigned to the other condition. So even though they were aware that they were potentially in the placebo condition, the design was set up that in the second part of the study, they would be in the active condition. So that should actually keep people motivated to accomplish until the end of the study. So it was more, I think, personal issues or fatigue, or it was quite bothersome to go to the lab every time. That was causing people to drop out.
So perhaps a question for Nadia. Nadia, you found effects on cognition, mood, and even biological parameters. So what do you consider as your most powerful effect, and what should we take from this study?
Well, I think because we found biological effects as well, we can state that there is something going on. But I think expectancy effects also plays a role, of course, in because if you feel that you're under the influence, of course, you're going to focus more on the symptoms you're feeling, and maybe have a more positive attitude towards what you're feeling. But we can also already see that in the 5 micrograms. Well, let me start over. After each test day, we also ask the participants, what did you think you received today? And with the 5 and the placebo, the 5 micrograms and the placebo test day, participants did not really know what they had. So for instance, if they had the 5 micrograms, 50% guessed they had placebo, and vice versa. But we do see in the 5 micrograms that there is already an increase in BDNF visible in blood samples. And we can also see that with the attention task, that the majority of the observations showed improved attention. I think that already says something about that's not purely expectation, because we also see that in the 20 microgram, people report to be less concentrated compared to the placebo. So if it's purely expectation, then you would think that people felt more concentrated while they were under the influence, but we did not see that. So I think that's also a very important thing that we found in our study.
Mm-hmm. And that links perhaps to what Michiel also stated in the end. Michiel, you're now working on new stuff, trying to figure out what effect placebo has and what additional effects psilocybin, I assume psilocybin has. So how are you going to investigate that?
Well, an obvious idea is, of course, to manipulate expectations. So instead of keeping participants blinded to their condition, you can actually give them prior information about what condition they are assigned to, and use a moderate amount or quite a moderate amount of deception to actually convince people that they're either in the microdosing or in the placebo condition. And then by doing like this 2x2 design, so they're microdosing, not microdosing, they're expecting to microdose or not, you can actually try to tease those factors apart. Like, what is the actual effect of microdosing and what is the effect of expectations? And actually it's interesting, if you talk to people in the microdosing community, many people would argue that it's the combined effect. It's not only the microdose doing its thing, but that you should have a specific intention for using the microdose in order to accomplish something. So that it is both the substance plus the set or the intention that people have for using it. Well, but that is one way to go about it. Yeah.
I'm looking forward to the results, perhaps at the next conference. Let me see what other, oh yeah, perhaps this one. Michiel, so you gave them 6 doses. Did they experience effects in between? Withdrawal effects or other things?
Well, we included several scales to measure the effects on emotional well-being, and that didn't work out as expected. So there we had predicted that overall people would feel happier and feel less stress and be more attuned to other people's emotions, but this did not turn out to be the case. So we had some questionnaires in between, but also experimental tasks in the lab that were related to emotion perception. So again, for the people interested, I can refer to the Open Science Framework, and then I can actually put the link in the chat. Where you can look up all the different measures that we included in this study. But actually this was one of the few dependent measures showing an effect. For the rest, we got a lot of null findings for this study.
Yeah. There is another question to Nadia. An ADHD diagnosis often includes a measure of reaction lapses. Do you think that microdosing might help attention in ADHD brains? And I also posted a link to a study we will be doing in the chat. But yeah, what is your idea?
Well, I think there is indeed a link, and that people could benefit from microdosing, at least with LSD. I don't know about psilocybin, but we also had a questionnaire published about, and then we asked participants, are you diagnosed with a certain disorder, and do you microdose in order to reduce the symptoms, and do you use the conventional treatment? And then we indeed found that for ADHD group, that people reported that microdosing actually was more beneficial to them compared to the conventional treatment they received for their symptoms. So I think there is indeed, but of course research still needs to find out, but I think really there is something here for ADHD.
I think so too. Perhaps a last question for Palas. There is somebody who says, do you analyze the cognitive test results by individual question? I was in your study, sadly in the placebo group, But regardless, on some weeks, it seemed to me that my cognitive performance was up only some of the cognitive tasks, mental rotation, for example. I think it's not too far-fetched to think it might be the case for the MD groups as well.
Sorry, I muted myself. So we had 6 cognitive tests in the study, and what I showed you on the slides, we combined them in a way so that there was an cognitive performance score, and there were no results in that. But when you're looking at individually all of the 6 tasks that we had, none of them had any positive outcomes. That being said, I should say that the rotation, so the task that the participants mentioned, that was by far the closest to being significant. I mean, I think I still had like a p-value of 0.1 or something like that. But that was the one of the cognitive that was closest to being significant.
Okay, thank you. So we are at the end of the session. I still see some questions, but perhaps you can continue in the virtual room. There is a question about whether set and setting can influence the effect response, and perhaps a labs setting may shift to a negative or a closed effect. Oh yeah, now they post the virtual meeting room in the chat. And yes, somebody says, thank you for your presentations. Indeed, thank you for your presentations. Keep up the good work, and hopefully we will have a next session or more sessions on microdosing in the coming years at this conference. So enjoy the conference, and bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.